Calvin was smiling before he even entered the office. David looked calm, but inside he was thinking the same thing his older brother was thinking. Today had to be important. Their father did not summon both of them to the executive floor unless something major was happening. The company headquarters stood above downtown Dallas, a symbol of everything Jeffrey had built over the last 30 years. Employees moved through the building with purpose. Investors waited months for meetings. Competitors watched every decision the company made. And someday, one of Jeffrey's sons would help lead it. At least that was what Calvin believed. "Maybe today's the day," Calvin said as the elevator doors opened. David glanced at him. "The day for what?" Calvin laughed. "You know exactly what," David smiled. "I know what you're hoping for." Calvin straightened his jacket. "Why wouldn't I? We've both spent years preparing." The office assistant opened the large doors. "Your father is ready for you." The brothers stepped inside. Jeffrey sat behind his desk without speaking. The massive windows behind him revealed the Dallas skyline stretching into the distance. Usually, Jeffrey greeted them immediately. Today, he didn't. Instead, he looked at both sons quietly. Calvin exchanged a brief glance with David. Something felt different. Finally, Jeffrey opened a drawer. Neither son expected what came next. Jeffrey placed a single $50 bill on the desk, then another, one in front of Calvin, one in front of David. For a moment, nobody spoke. Calvin stared at the money. Then he laughed. Not a small laugh, a full laugh, the kind someone makes when they think a joke is coming. "Seriously?" Calvin asked. David looked down at his own bill. Unlike his brother, he wasn't laughing. He wasn't confused either. He was curious. His eyes moved from the money to his father's face. "What's this for?" David asked. Jeffrey folded his hands. His expression never changed. Calvin leaned back in his chair. "If this is some kind of business lesson, I think we're missing the punchline." Still, Jeffrey said nothing. That silence slowly removed the humor from the room. David noticed it first. Calvin noticed it second. The smiles disappeared. Jeffrey pushed the money slightly closer to them. Neither son touched it. Finally, Jeffrey spoke. His voice was calm, controlled, serious. "For the next 7 days." He paused. Calvin's eyebrows tightened. David leaned forward slightly. Jeffrey continued. "For the next 7 days, that's all you get." The room became completely silent. Calvin blinked. David stopped moving. Neither brother spoke. Neither brother laughed, because for the first time they realized their father wasn't joking, and whatever was about to happen next was far bigger than $50. Dear God, thank you for bringing us together today. Bless every person listening to this story. Give us wisdom to recognize life's lessons, humility to grow from our mistakes, and strength to make the right choices even when they are difficult. May this story encourage, inspire, and remind us that true success begins with good character. Amen. Welcome to Love, Money, and Secret, where America's greatest stories and life lessons meet creativity and heart. If you're new to the family, we're grateful to have you here. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring more unforgettable stories your way. Nobody touched the money. Not Jeffrey, not Calvin, not David. The two brothers sat frozen for a moment, trying to decide whether they had misunderstood what their father had just said. Calvin finally broke the silence. 7 days? Jeffrey nodded. 7 days. Calvin pointed at the $50 bill. $50? Yes. Calvin laughed again, but this time the confidence sounded forced. "Okay, I get it. What's the real challenge?" Jeffrey's expression remained unchanged. "This is the real challenge." David stared at his father. The room suddenly felt different. A few moments earlier, he thought they were about to discuss company, leadership. Now they were discussing $50. Nothing about this made sense. Calvin shook his head. "No, seriously." Jeffrey didn't answer. Instead, he reached for a folder sitting beside him. He opened it and began reading. "No company cards." Calvin's smile disappeared. "No family accounts?" David sat up straighter. "No help from friends." Calvin frowned. "No special treatment." The room grew quieter. "No company housing." Calvin looked at David. David looked back at him. Jeffrey closed the folder. "Nothing?" Silence. Calvin stared at his father as though waiting for the hidden camera to appear. "You're kidding." "I'm not." Calvin leaned forward. "Dad, I spend more than $50 before lunch." Jeffrey nodded. "I know. Then what's the point?" Jeffrey didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked a question. "When was the last time you had to make $50 last an entire week?" Calvin opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because he genuinely didn't know. David remained quiet. Jeffrey turned toward him. "What about you?" David thought for a moment. "I don't think I ever have." Jeffrey nodded again. "Exactly." Calvin rubbed his forehead. "This is ridiculous." "Why?" "Because we're not college students." Jeffrey's eyes narrowed slightly. "No." He paused. "You're future leaders." The answer landed heavily. Neither son spoke. Jeffrey stood and walked toward the windows overlooking Dallas. Cars moved through the streets below. Thousands of people were heading to jobs, running businesses, paying bills, raising families, making difficult choices every day. Jeffrey looked down at the city, then back at his sons. You both know how to manage wealth. He pointed toward the skyline. You grew up around success. Then his voice became firmer. But I don't know if you understand struggle. The words settled over the room. David felt something shift inside him. Calvin crossed his arms. What struggle got to do with running a company? Jeffrey turned toward him. Everything. The answer came so quickly that Calvin couldn't respond. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. David noticed it. Jeffrey walked back to his desk. The challenge starts now. Calvin shook his head. You're seriously sending us out with $50? Yes. For an entire week? Yes. No backup? No. No exceptions? No. David slowly picked up the $50 bill, not because he understood the challenge, but because he understood his father. Jeffrey never wasted time. If he was doing this, there was a reason. A very important reason. Calvin finally grabbed his bill. This has to be the strangest thing you've ever done. Jeffrey smiled for the first time. A small smile, the kind that made both sons even more nervous, because it suggested he knew something they didn't. And as the brothers left the office, one question followed them into the hallway. Why would a billionaire risk teaching his sons a lesson with only $50? Before we continue, tell us in the comments. Who do you think will handle this challenge better, Calvin or David? And if you're enjoying the story so far, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves powerful life lessons. Your support helps Love, Money, and Secret reach more people every day. Calvin stopped just outside Jeffrey's office door with the $50 bill, folded between his fingers like it had personally insulted him. David stepped out beside him, quieter, watching his brother's face. This is nonsense, Calvin said. David looked back at the closed office door. He sounded serious. Calvin scoffed. Dad always sounds serious. That doesn't mean this makes sense. Before David could answer, the door opened again. Jeffrey's voice came from inside. Both of you, come back for 1 minute. Calvin turned with a sharp breath. Good. Maybe he changed his mind. David said nothing. They returned to the office. Jeffrey was standing now, one hand resting on the edge of his desk. I want the rules clear before you leave this building, he said. Calvin forced a smile. Dad, I understand the rules. You gave us $50 and took away everything useful. Jeffrey looked at him. No, I gave you $50 and removed everything that usually hides your judgment. That answer wiped the smile off Calvin's face. David lowered his eyes to the bill in his hand. Jeffrey continued. You will not use employees for favors. You will not call anyone connected to this company. You will not use your last name to receive special treatment. Calvin frowned. So we're supposed to pretend we're strangers? No, Jeffrey said. You're supposed to learn what your name cannot do for you. David nodded slowly. What happens if we fail? Jeffrey turned to him. Then you tell me why you failed. Calvin laughed under his breath. That's encouraging. Jeffrey ignored the comment. At the end of 7 days, return here and explain what you did with what you were given. Calvin lifted the bill. And if one of us turns this into something impressive? Jeffrey studied him. Impressive is not the word I'm looking for. That confused Calvin. David caught it. What word are you looking for? David asked. Jeffrey's answer came quietly. Ready? Neither son spoke. For the first time, Calvin understood this was connected to something bigger than discomfort. He just hated that David seemed to understand it faster. Jeffrey pointed toward the door. The challenge has already started. Calvin walked out first, stiff and annoyed. David followed, still thinking. By the elevator, Calvin pulled out his phone, then stopped. No company driver, no family account, no easy ride. He muttered, Fine. I'll figure out transportation. David glanced at the $50 bill again. I'm going to figure out what I can do before I figure out what I can buy. Calvin looked at him. That sounds like something broke people say to feel poetic. David smiled. Maybe broke people know something we don't. Calvin shook his head and pressed the elevator button. Two brothers left the same office with the same $50. Calvin was already planning comfort. David was already planning survival, and Jeffrey watched from inside his office, knowing the real difference between them had finally begun to show. The elevator doors opened into the lobby. Calvin stepped out first. David followed a few feet behind. For several seconds, neither brother spoke. They crossed the front entrance of the company headquarters and stopped on the sidewalk outside. The Dallas afternoon moved around them. Employees hurried past. Vehicles moved through traffic. Ordinary life continued as if nothing had happened. For Calvin and David, everything had changed. Calvin pulled out his phone and looked at it. Then he laughed. This might be the first time I've owned a phone that's smarter than my bank account. David smiled. You're taking this surprisingly well. No, I'm refusing to panic. Kelvin folded the $50 bill and slipped it into his pocket. There's a difference. David looked at him. So what's your plan? Kelvin answered immediately. Easy. The speed of the answer caught David's attention. You already have one? Of course. Kelvin pointed toward the street. First, I need somewhere comfortable. David raised an eyebrow. Comfortable? Yes. Kelvin looked genuinely confused. What did you expect me to say? David laughed. I don't know. Maybe food. Kelvin shook his head. Food comes later. David stared at him. You've got $50. I know. 7 days. I know. No backup. I know. David paused. Yet comfort is your first priority. Kelvin smiled confidently. That's because stress makes people stupid. David couldn't argue with that, but something about the answer bothered him. Kelvin wasn't thinking about how long the challenge would last. He was thinking about how to make the challenge feel easier. There was a difference, a very important difference. David looked down at his own $50 bill. Unlike Kelvin, he hadn't spent a single dollar in his mind yet. He was still trying to understand the challenge. His father had built $1 billion company. Jeffrey wasn't known for wasting time, which meant this test wasn't random. There had to be something bigger underneath it. Kelvin interrupted his thoughts. So what's your plan? David shrugged. Haven't decided. You should. I will. Kelvin folded his arms. You don't seem worried. David smiled. I'm worried. Then why are you calm? Because worrying doesn't solve anything. Kelvin laughed. That sounds exactly like something Dad would say. David accepted the criticism. Maybe. The brothers stood quietly for a moment, then Kelvin checked the time. Well, I'm leaving. Where are you going? Kelvin grinned. To improve my situation. David laughed. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're getting. For the first time that afternoon, Kelvin looked excited. Not because he respected the challenge, because he believed he could outsmart it. David noticed the confidence. He also noticed something else. Kelvin hadn't asked how he could make $50 last. Workers carrying equipment. He had only asked how he could make the challenge more comfortable. David looked at the people moving through the city around him. Delivery drivers unloading packages, store owners serving customers. Everywhere he looked, people were creating value for someone. That thought stayed with him. Maybe the challenge wasn't about spending. Maybe it was about usefulness. Kelvin started walking backward toward the curb. Try not to become a philosopher before next week. David laughed. Try not to spend half your money today. Kelvin pointed at him. No promises. A moment later, they headed in different directions. Same city, same challenge, same $50. Yet their first decisions revealed something important. Kelvin was searching for comfort. David was searching for understanding. And before the first day was over, that difference would start changing everything. Kelvin felt good for almost 20 minutes. That was how long it took before reality started charging him money. He walked 3 blocks away from the company headquarters and stopped near the curb. Normally, a company vehicle would already be waiting. Not today. He looked around. No driver, no luxury vehicle, no convenient solution, just Dallas traffic and $50. Kelvin pulled out his phone. Fine. He ordered transportation. A few seconds later, he stared at the price on the screen. His eyebrows rose. What? He checked again. Same number. Kelvin laughed. That's ridiculous. For the first time in years, he actually cared what transportation cost. After several seconds of staring at the screen, he canceled it. I'll walk. 5 minutes later, he regretted that decision. 10 minutes later, he hated it. 15 minutes later, he was sweating. A short distance that once felt invisible suddenly felt very real. Kelvin stopped outside a small restaurant. Food sounded like a better idea. He walked inside. The menu immediately offended him. He looked once, looked again, then lowered it. People pay this much for lunch? Nobody answered. Kelvin sat down anyway. A few minutes later, food arrived. It wasn't terrible. It wasn't amazing either. What shocked him was the bill. He stared at the receipt, then stared at what remained of his money, then stared back at the receipt. There's no way. The numbers didn't change. Kelvin slowly counted the bills left in his wallet. His confidence lost a little weight. Not much. Irritation, wealth, conclusion. Just enough to become uncomfortable. Outside the restaurant, he continued walking. A convenience store caught his attention. He stepped inside. Water, snack, small necessities. Nothing expensive. At least that was what he expected. Several purchases later, he left carrying a bag and a growing sense of. The challenge had barely started. Yet the money already looked smaller. Much smaller. Kelvin stopped beside a window and counted again. He did the math twice. Then a third time. The result remained unchanged. How do people do this every week? The question slipped out before he could stop it. A few pedestrians walked past. Nobody answered. Nobody cared. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Kelvin wasn't looking at. He was looking at limits, and he didn't like what he saw. Still, instead of changing his approach, he reached a different. There had to be a shortcut, there always was. He simply hadn't found it yet. And that belief would cost him far more than the money already gone. By the next morning, Kelvin had learned one painful truth. $50 did not respect confidence. He sat on a bench with his phone in one hand and the remaining cash in the other. The number was embarrassing. He counted again, hoping mathematics might show mercy. It did not. Kelvin leaned back and muttered, "This challenge is disrespectful." His stomach made a small sound. He frowned. "Don't start." A few people passed by, minding their business. Kelvin looked at them, like they had all been secretly trained for a world he had never studied. He opened his phone and searched for cheap breakfasts nearby. The first place looked affordable until he checked the full price. Food, tax, drink, transportation if he didn't want to walk. Everything had a handout. Kelvin stood up. "No, I'm not letting a breakfast sandwich defeat me." He walked instead. When he reached the place, he ordered the cheapest thing he could tolerate. The portion came out smaller than expected. He stared at it. "This is breakfast or a business sample?" He took a bite, annoyed. The hunger did not leave. It only became quieter. After eating, Kelvin tried to think like a strategist. That lasted about 3 minutes. Then he started thinking like someone looking for an escape. Maybe he could call someone without technically asking for help. Maybe he could accidentally run into somebody who owed him a favor. Maybe he could use his charm. But Jeffrey's rule kept blocking him. No help from friends, no special treatment, no family name. Kelvin hated how clear the rules were. By afternoon, his frustration had grown teeth. He complained about walking, complained about food prices, complained about how ordinary errands suddenly felt like financial decisions. At one point, he stood outside a laundromat, staring through the glass. He had never cared what laundry cost. Now the machines looked like tiny metal thieves. "No," he said, stepping back. "My clothes are not dirty enough for this level of disrespect." He walked away, but not proudly, just cheaply. By evening, Kelvin's money had shrunk again, not because the world was unfair, because he kept making comfort-based choices and calling them necessities. He had not adapted. He had not learned. He had only blamed the challenge for exposing him. Sitting alone later, Kelvin stared at the few bills left in his hand. For the first time, he wondered whether David was doing better. That thought irritated him more than hunger, because if David was managing this better, then the problem was not the $50. The problem was Kelvin, and Kelvin was not ready to admit that yet. Have you ever learned a lesson the hard way? Tell us in the comments. Because sometimes life teaches us most when comfort is removed. And if this story is speaking to you, please like, share, and subscribe to Love, Money and Secrets so more people can hear stories with meaning. While Kelvin was fighting with breakfast prices, David stood outside a small Dallas repair shop with his $50 still untouched. He had walked for nearly an hour, not because he enjoyed walking, but because walking gave him time to observe. People were busy everywhere. A man struggled to carry boxes from a delivery van. A woman tried to hold open a door while balancing supplies. A store owner swept the front entrance with one hand while answering a phone with the other. David watched quietly. For the first time, the city did not look like a place full of services waiting for him. It looked like a place full of people working hard to keep things moving. He looked at the $50 bill in his pocket. "If I spend this first," he said to himself, "I'm already losing." So he made a different decision. He walked toward the repair shop and saw a stack of boxes sitting near the entrance. The man carrying them looked tired. David stepped closer. "Need help with those?" The man looked at him carefully. "You work here?" "No," David said. "But I can lift a box." The man gave him a small laugh. "You dress too clean for this." David looked down at himself. "Give me 10 minutes. I'll fix that." The man laughed harder and pointed toward the boxes. "All right. Start with those." David picked up the first box with confidence. 3 steps later, his confidence nearly left his body. The box was heavier than it looked. He adjusted his grip and tried not to embarrass himself. The man noticed anyway. "You good?" David forced a smile. "Yes. I just underestimated the personality of this box." That earned another laugh. For the next half hour, David carried boxes, arranged supplies, and followed instructions. He made mistakes. He put one stack in the wrong corner. He nearly dropped a package. He bumped his shoulder against the door frame and pretended it was part of his strategy. By the time he finished, his shirt was dusty and his hands were sore. But something unexpected happened. He felt useful. The man handed him a bottle of water. David reached for his cash. The man shook his head. "You helped me. Water's on me." David paused. It was small, very small. but it taught him something immediately. Effort could open doors money never touched. He didn't spend $1, yet he had gained water, conversation, and a new understanding. Before leaving, David asked, "Do you know anyone nearby who needs help for a few hours?" The man studied him again. "You really looking for work?" "I'm looking to be useful," the man nodded slowly. "That's different," David smiled. "That's what I'm learning." He walked away with the same $50 in his pocket, but he was no longer thinking like a rich man protecting cash. He was thinking like a man learning value, and that was the first real difference between him and Kelvin. David left the repair shop feeling different. Not richer, not more comfortable, just different. The bottle of water was gone within minutes, but the lesson stayed with him. For the first time since the challenge started, he wasn't thinking about what $50 could buy. He was thinking about what he could do. That thought carried him through the rest of the afternoon. As he walked through Dallas, he noticed opportunities everywhere. Not opportunities to spend, opportunities to help, opportunities to learn, opportunities to earn trust. A day earlier, he would have walked past most of them without noticing. Now they stood out. Near a small loading area, he saw several heavy containers waiting to be moved. A worker was attempting to move them alone. David walked over. "Need another set of hands?" The worker looked at him. "You know how to use a hand truck?" David answered honestly. "No." The worker laughed. "At least you're honest." 5 minutes later, David discovered that using a hand truck looked much easier than it actually was. The first container tilted sideways. The second nearly rolled away. The third forced him to jump backward to avoid losing control completely. The worker folded his arms. "You sure you've done physical work before?" David grinned. "Depends how loosely we're defining physical." The worker laughed so hard he had to stop working for a moment. By the end of the hour, David had learned something simple. Looking capable and being capable were not the same thing. That lesson stayed with him. The next morning brought another surprise. His body hurt. His shoulders hurt. His legs hurt. Muscles he didn't even know existed suddenly demanded attention. David sat on a bench and laughed. "Apparently my expensive education forgot to teach me about this." Despite the soreness, he felt proud. Not because he was succeeding, because he was improving. There was a difference. As the challenge continued, David kept trading effort for opportunity. Sometimes he helped move supplies. Sometimes he assisted with simple tasks. Sometimes he simply listened to people. The conversations became just as valuable as the work. He met people managing budgets carefully, people solving problems daily, people making difficult decisions without complaining. Their lives looked nothing like his. Yet many of them carried themselves with confidence. Not because they had money, because they had capability. That realization changed something inside him. One evening, David sat quietly counting his remaining cash. He still had most of it, not because he was protecting every dollar, because he had learned that money wasn't always the first solution. Sometimes effort solved the problem first, sometimes relationships mattered more, sometimes humility created opportunities that pride never could. For years, David believed leadership meant having answers. Now he was beginning to understand something larger. Leadership often started with listening, with learning, with understanding people before trying to direct them. Meanwhile, somewhere else in Dallas, Kelvin was still searching for shortcuts. David wasn't searching anymore. He was growing, and with every lesson, he was becoming someone Jeffrey hoped both sons would one day become. Someone who understood that value begins with people, not money. By the 6th day, the challenge no longer felt temporary. For Kelvin, it felt personal. For David, it felt educational. The difference had become impossible to ignore. Kelvin sat alone staring at what remained of his money. The amount was small, much smaller than he expected when the challenge began. Several times during the week he had convinced himself things would improve. Several times he had searched for an easier path. Several times he had promised himself he would become more careful. Yet somehow he kept finding new reasons to spend. Now the challenge was almost over. Instead of feeling confident, Kelvin felt irritated. Not because he was failing, because he could not find someone else to blame. He had blamed prices. He had blamed inconvenience. He had blamed the challenge itself. But the remaining cash sitting in front of him kept pointing back to the same person. Kelvin. Across Dallas, David's final days looked completely different. He was tired. His muscles still reminded him of tasks he wasn't used to doing. But something surprising had happened. The challenge had become easier, not because he had more money, because he had more understanding. People spoke to him differently now, not because of his family name, because he had shown up consistently. David found himself looking forward to conversations, looking forward to learning, looking forward to opportunities to contribute. The change was subtle, yet important. Earlier in the week, David had been focused on surviving the challenge. Now he was focused on becoming useful. Neither son realized Jeffrey had been paying attention the entire time. Not through secret reports, not through employees, through something much simpler. He understood his sons. Jeffrey knew that pressure revealed habits, habits revealed character, and character revealed leadership. Meanwhile, both brothers reached the same conclusion for completely different reasons. They believed the challenge would be judged by results. Kelvin assumed the winner would be whoever protected the most money. David assumed the winner would be whoever created the most value. Neither considered another possibility. Neither realized Jeffrey wasn't measuring dollars at all. As the 7th day approached, both sons became increasingly focused on the upcoming meeting. Kelvin mentally prepared explanations. David mentally prepared lessons. One wanted to defend his performance. The other wanted to explain his growth. Yet both were walking toward a conversation that would change the way. They understood success forever, and neither one saw it coming. On the 7th day, Kelvin arrived at Jeffrey's office early. Not peaceful, early. There was a difference. He stepped out of the elevator with his shoulders straight and his face carefully prepared. He had spent the morning deciding how to explain himself without sounding defeated. David arrived a few minutes later. Kelvin looked him up and down. "You look tired." David smiled. "I am." Kelvin glanced at his hands. "Working hard? Learning hard?" Kelvin rolled his eyes. "Please don't say that in front of Dad." David laughed softly. "I wasn't planning to perform." Kelvin reached into his pocket and touched the little cash he had left. He did not want to ask David how much he still had. Not yet. The office door opened. Jeffrey stood inside. "Come in." Both sons entered. The Dallas skyline was visible behind Jeffrey again, just like the first day. But this time, the room felt different. 7 days earlier, Kelvin had entered expecting promotion talk. David had entered expecting business. Now both entered carrying lessons they had not expected to learn. Jeffrey sat down. Kelvin sat first, already prepared. David sat after him, calm but watchful. Jeffrey looked at both of them. "Let's begin." Kelvin cleared his throat. "I'll go first." Jeffrey nodded. Kelvin placed his remaining cash on the desk. It was not much. He spoke quickly. "The challenge was harder than necessary. Prices are unreasonable. Transportation alone changes everything. Food adds up. Small things become expensive. Also, some rules made no practical sense." David looked at him but said nothing. Kelvin continued, "In real business, nobody leads with all tools removed. So, honestly, I think the challenge proved that resources matter." Jeffrey listened without interrupting. When Kelvin finished, Jeffrey simply said, "Thank you." That made Kelvin uncomfortable. No argument, no praise, no correction, just calm listening. Jeffrey turned to David. David placed his $50 bill on the desk. Kelvin stared. "You still have it?" David nodded. "Most of it." Kelvin's mouth opened slightly. David looked at Jeffrey. "I learned that money helps, but it should not be the first answer every time. I helped people. I made mistakes. I worked badly before I worked better. I listened more than I talked. People taught me things I would never learn from a report." Jeffrey's face remained steady, but his eyes sharpened. David continued. "I thought leadership meant being prepared to command. This week made me think it starts with understanding what people carry before you ask them to carry more." Kelvin shifted in his seat. For once, he had no quick reply. The room became quiet. Jeffrey looked at the money on his desk, Kelvin's little remaining cash, David's almost untouched bill. Then he looked at his sons. Neither one knew what he was thinking. Kelvin expected judgment. David expected questions. But Jeffrey leaned back and said only one thing. "Now we can talk about the real test." Jeffrey looked at both sons for a long moment. Kelvin sat stiffly, waiting for criticism. David sat quietly, waiting for understanding. On the desk between them were the results of 7 days. Kelvin's remaining cash looked tired and small. David's $50 bill looked almost untouched. But Jeffrey did not reach for either one. That made Kelvin nervous. "So," Kelvin said, clearing his throat, "are we comparing amounts?" Jeffrey shook his head. "No." Kelvin blinked. "Then what are we comparing?" Jeffrey leaned forward. "Judgment?" The words settled between them. David lowered his eyes. Kelvin frowned. "Dad, with respect, I already explained what happened. The money wasn't enough for normal living. Every basic thing costs. More than people think." Jeffrey nodded. "That part is true." Kelvin looked relieved for half a second, then Jeffrey continued. "But you treated every difficulty like an insult." Kelvin's relief disappeared. Jeffrey did not raise his voice. "You complained about prices, transportation, food, inconvenience, and rules. But I listened for one thing you never said." Kelvin swallowed. "What?" Jeffrey answered. "People." The room went quiet. Jeffrey turned to David. "You didn't talk much about comfort. You talked about work, mistakes, listening, respect. You notice people carrying burdens that never appear on company reports. David took a slow breath. I didn't understand that before. I know, Jeffrey said. That is why I sent you both out there. Kelvin shifted in his chair. So David wins because he kept more. Money? No, Jeffrey said. Kelvin looked confused. David looked up. Jeffrey placed both hands on the desk. The test was never about $50. The room fell completely silent. Kelvin stared at his father. David stopped moving. Jeffrey continued, If I wanted to know who could save money, I would have given you a budget sheet. If I wanted to know who could earn money, I would have given you a sales target. He looked from Kelvin to David. I wanted to know what kind of men you became when comfort was removed. Kelvin had no quick reply. For once, his pride did not know where to stand. David's face softened, but he did not smile. He understood this was not a victory moment. It was a truth moment. Jeffrey's voice became quieter. Money shows what you can access. Pressure shows who you are. Kelvin looked down at the desk. For the first time, he did not defend himself. And David, sitting beside him, understood the greatest lesson had just begun. Jeffrey looked at Kelvin first. I am not disappointed because you struggled, he said. Struggle teaches. I am concerned because you resisted the lesson. Kelvin's jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet. Jeffrey turned to David. And I am not proud of you because you kept most of the money. I am. Proud because you learned from people without looking down on them. David nodded slowly. I still have a lot to learn. That answer is why you are ready to begin, Jeffrey said. Kelvin looked up. Jeffrey continued. David, I am moving you into leadership preparation. Not full control, not a crown. Preparation, you will learn from the ground up, department by department, person by person. David sat still. He had expected a lesson. He had not expected trust. Thank you, David said. I won't treat it lightly. Jeffrey nodded. See that you don't. Kelvin looked away, trying to hide the sting. Jeffrey noticed. Kelvin forced himself to meet his father's eyes. I am not throwing you away. Kelvin's expression changed. Jeffrey said, You failed part of the test, but failure is only final when pride refuses correction. Kelvin swallowed. So what happens to me? You start again, Jeffrey said. You will spend the next few months learning the parts of this company you used to ignore. Not from the top floor, from the working floor. Kelvin almost argued. Almost. But something stopped him. Maybe hunger. Maybe embarrassment. Maybe the memory of counting small bills and realizing life did not bend for his comfort. He finally said, I need that. David looked at him, surprised. Kelvin gave a small, tired laugh. Don't look shocked. I can learn one lesson per week. Jeffrey smiled. Months later, the change was visible. David grew into responsibility without arrogance. He listened before making decisions. He asked better questions. Kelvin changed too. Slowly, but honestly. He stopped mocking simple work. He stopped treating comfort like a right. He and David began speaking less like rivals and more like brothers. Jeffrey watched them one evening from the same Dallas office where the test began. This time, he felt peace. His empire was not safe because one son had more money left. It was safe because both sons had finally started becoming men of character. And Jeffrey understood the smallest test had revealed the biggest truth. Months after the challenge ended, the $50 bills were long gone. The lessons were not. David continued preparing for greater responsibility inside the company. He spent time learning every level of the business, not because Jeffrey ordered him to, but because he genuinely wanted to understand the people who made the company successful. Kelvin's journey looked different, yet it was equally important. He stopped measuring success by convenience. He stopped assuming money could solve every problem. Most importantly, he stopped treating difficult experiences as punishment. Instead, he began treating them as education. Over time, the relationship between the brothers changed. The competition that once stood between them slowly gave way to respect. David no longer viewed Kelvin as someone who refused to learn. Kelvin no longer viewed David as someone who simply got lucky. Both understood that growth looks different for different people. Jeffrey watched these changes with gratitude. For years, he worried about the future of everything he had built. Not because of market conditions, not because of competitors, because leadership eventually passes from one generation to the next. Now he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Confidence. Not confidence in money. Not confidence in buildings. Not confidence in titles. Confidence in character. Because character survives when comfort disappears. And that was the lesson he wanted his sons to carry for the rest of their lives. The challenge had started with $50, but it ended with something far more valuable. Wisdom, humility, responsibility, and a deeper understanding of people. Because leadership does not begin when someone sits in a powerful office. Leadership begins when someone understands the people they serve. That is why character matters more than comfort. That is why money should remain a tool, never an identity. That is why humility creates opportunities pride cannot see. And that is why the smallest tests often reveal the biggest truths. Thank you for spending this time with us on Love, Money, and Secret. Now we would love to hear from you. Which son impressed you most, Kelvin or David? Do you think Jeffrey chose the right person for leadership preparation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story inspired you, taught you something, or reminded you of an important life lesson, please take a moment to like this video, share it with friends and family, subscribe to Love, Money, and Secret. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful American stories, filled with life lessons, hope, growth, and unforgettable moments. Until next time, remember, real success is not measured by what you have, it is measured by who you become.